This morning, the New York Times is reporting former President Donald Trump once proposed using missiles to destroy drug labs in Mexico. It's one of the revelations in a new book from former Defense Secretary Mark Esper titled A Sacred Oath. According to the Times, which obtained a copy of the memoir, quote, when Mr. Esper raised various objections, Mr. Trump said, we could just shoot some Patriot missiles and take out the labs quietly, adding, no one would know it was us. Mr. Trump said he would just say the United States had not conducted the strike. Mr. Esper recounts, writing, he would have thought it was a joke had he not been staring Mr. Trump in the face. The Times reports Trump also asked Secretary Esper if the military could put 10,000 active duty troops on the streets of Washington after protests and riots erupted in the wake of the killing of George Floyd by police in Minneapolis. Referring to the demonstrators, former President Trump reportedly asked Esper, quote, can't you just shoot them? Esper reportedly described Trump as a, quote, unprincipled person who, given his self-interest, should not be in the position of public service. You'll remember Esper was fired by Trump just days after the 2020 presidential election was called in favor of Joe Biden. We've reached out to former President Trump's team for comment. NBC News has not yet seen a copy of Esper's book. Secretary Esper will be our guest on Morning Joe next Tuesday. Mike Barnicle, so these are fascinating, perhaps unsurprising revelations, but it joins the list of former Trump administration officials who sort of found Jesus when the book deal comes.
Yeah, I mean, here's Mark Esper, the Secretary of Defense, who sits with the President of the United States, who just basically proves by his utterances to Mark Esper, as quoted in Mr. Esper's book, that he is mentally unstable. What does Mark Esper do as Secretary of Defense? He goes back and shuts up about it until Random House or whatever the publisher was hands him a check. Oh, I got a good story for you. Please, just stop it. These people ought to be banned from coming on and promoting these books.
Well, we have them on Tuesday.
Ask him about that. Starting Wednesday, yes. What do you think, Richard?
Look, as a former administration official, I worked for 4 presidents. There's certain things you have to keep quiet. That's part of the deal of when you go into administration. But when you see stuff that clearly is beyond the pale, against the law and so forth, you've got the duty, one, to push back privately. And if it's going to go ahead all the same, that's when that's why people should resign. They should resign in principle and explain it. And to simply sit on things that are clearly unacceptable, that presidents or officials ought not to be doing, I think Mike's right. It raises fundamental questions about whether people have met their obligations. They don't work at the end of the day for the president as the person. They work for us.
Now, there is the argument, Mika, that we'll just put out there, and we look forward to talking to Secretary Esper on Tuesday about all this, that these men like General Milley, like various secretaries of various cabinets, if I leave, look who's behind me, that they had some duty to serve as a guardrail or a barrier to these things. The next guy might say, yeah, Donald Trump, you can launch missiles into Mexico and pretend it's not us.
I think it's impossible to understand what it was like to be in the shoes of someone who was working directly under President Trump. But Carol Lee, there are now countless stories of people coming out of that White House with even worse revelations than the ones we saw out loud. You know, the president didn't have much of a filter at the time and said the most inane, stupid and dangerous things right on the world stage. I think stunning the media and desensitizing his constituents to what our values are. I mean, this is a man who spoke openly about shaking down Volodymyr Zelensky for dirt on Joe Biden. So I'm kind of with Mike Barnicle. I kind of wish somebody would have spoken out in real time.
Yeah, what's really interesting about this, Mika, is it echoes what former National Security Advisor John Bolton wrote, and what you, in the sense that the overarching theme, according to the New York Times story in Esper's book, is that it was all about for former President Trump's reelection, that everything was political, that his decisions were motivated by his own standing politically and his ambitions. And that's the lens through which we've seen a number of these stories be told through, is that that was the motivating factor. What's also striking is that, like John Bolton, Secretary Esper was at the forefront of some of the most serious decisions and things that were going on in any administration. He was the Secretary of Defense, and the way that he describes the president wanting to use the military and some of the president's aides, apparently, according to the New York Times story on the book, including Steve Miller sending 250,000 U.S. troops down to the border, things like that. What is also striking about this is that Jesper talks about, to everyone's point, he talks about that he thought about resigning. In fact, we reported while he was still secretary that he had written a letter, a resignation letter that he would keep around just in case. And he says the reason that he stayed is because President Trump was surrounded by yes men. Well, Esper's nickname, particularly on the Hill, was Jesper, because he was seen as somebody who just said yes to the president and didn't stand up to the president. And so part of what you're seeing here is, and we've seen these before, as everyone's noted, is this sort of reputation laundering book. And we'll see if it works. But the stories in here, setting aside the motivations and what Esper kept to himself, are really striking.
You know, Richard, you spoke about, working for different presidents of both parties. And part of the depressing aspect of this tale from Mark Esper's book, and it's just the latest, as Carol pointed out, there have been others, is you wonder what happens to people who have some intellect, clearly, some experience, clearly. And what happens to them when they're in the Oval Office with the President of the United States. And do they not realize that the oath that they took to perform their duties is to the country? It's not to the president. And so these things occur repeatedly with different cabinet members. We've all read the confessions now. You wonder what happens to their courage and their sense of what this country is all about.
It's a great story by Bob Strauss, who was, Mr. Democrat, Mr. Politics from Texas. He was against the war, had growing doubts against the war in Vietnam. He finally gets an audience with Lyndon Johnson, and he goes in there determined to tell Lyndon Johnson why the Vietnam War is a mistake. He gets in the Oval Office, and his courage deserts him. He gets the Lyndon Johnson treatment, and by the end of the meeting, he's saying, "Mr. President, you're doing a great job." He then says he went afterwards back home, took a shower, felt humiliated by what he hadn't done, and he promised if he ever got a chance to meet with an American president again, he would never do that. He would always tell the truth from that point on, and he did.
NBC News White House correspondent Carol Lee, that nickname Jesper is painful. Thank you very much for being on this morning.